Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let everyone else join the webinar.
I love the way you've coordinated your shirt with your flowers.
Yes, I always do.
That's a nice touch. Siberia's just joined.
Well, I think we'll get started. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our esteemed panel. This is Rachel Garrahan. I'm Jewellery Director at Vogue, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about Andrew Grima, who is one of the great jewellers of the 20th century. He was born in Rome 100 years ago and started out his career as a mechanical engineer. And it was while he was working after the war for his father-in-law in his jewellery manufacturing business that he caught the bug for design. He fell in love with a group of Brazilian gemstones, rough-cut amethysts, tourmalines, and so on. And he started to develop the signature style that we all know today, one that was bold, abstract, and sculptural. He's quickly made a name for himself, partly in thanks to the Goldsmiths exhibition of 1961, and soon found himself at the centre of London in the swinging 60s, where he won royal patronage, international design awards, and a huge international clientele of film stars and the like. Clients came to him for his incredibly modern jewellery that firmly put the emphasis on design rather than the sum of their precious parts. And his store on Jermyn Street in St James's, which was likened to a James Bond villain style lair, and his use of textured gold and semi-precious colourful stones really characterised the period. Since his death in 2007, his wife Jojo and daughter Francesca have carried the torch for Grima, creating highly distinctive pieces, many of which are still made by the same goldsmiths that work for Andrew. Bonhams itself has played a pivotal role in reviving interest in Grima's work, and fans today include the likes of Miuccia Prada and Marc Jacobs. And it goes without saying that his jewellery is featured often in the pages of Vogue and many other fashion magazines. Anyway, that is a short introduction from me, and it leaves me now to introduce you to our panel. First up is Francesca Grima, the jeweller and daughter of Andrew Grima. Hi. William Grant, Francesca's stepfather, and the author of Andrew Grima, the Father of Modern Jewellery, which has been published in time for the centenary. Ghika, the global head of jewellery at Bonhams, and Nick Foulkes, author, journalist, and collector of Grima's work.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
So, William, I'd love to start with you, actually, and just find out how Andrew Grima got started in his career as a jeweller.
Well, thank you, Rachel. We can see here a picture of Andrew, aged 5, taken in Palermo. As you say, he was born in Rome almost exactly 100 years ago. But the family moved quite quickly to Palermo because they had a business, a linen export business. They imported linen from Ireland, and it was hand finished in Sicily. So he's here not knowing that in a few months' time, his life's going to be upended by the rise of Benito Mussolini, who had quite a big impact on his early years. It was the rise of fascism in Italy was sufficiently troubling for his father to move the family to London, and he was Maltese, so he had a British passport. So they turfed up in Kew. Andrew obviously spoke Italian. He had a rough ride in his early days at school. And then the family grew to about 9 children. And about 10 years later, having had a fairly sort of innocuous childhood, Mussolini again intervened by invading Abyssinia, and the business in Italy collapsed immediately due to sanctions. Andrew had to leave school and effectively become the breadwinner of the family. He got a technical job in Wembley, I think it was, and his father was moved to a sanitarium in North London, where he stayed until he died in 1946. So his education, artistic, he used to attend art classes in the local art school in Richmond, but his sort of foray into jewellery was rather unconventional relative to his peers. A lot of the other great 1960s jewelers were about 8-9 years older than him, so they missed the war, and they had a rather conventional upbringing and university life. They went to St. Martin's and the Royal College, but Andrew was pitched into the war. He spent 6 years in Burma, but there was no formal training, there was no formal education in jewellery, but there was an artistic gene in the family, very strong artistic gene. His father was an art dealer, and he became a fabric designer. His mother was a novelist. His uncle was a painter. His sister Rosemary attended the Royal College and won the Prix de Rome for fashion. One of his ancestors designed part of the Trevi Fountain, Pietro Bracci, and he had a distant papal ancestor, Pope Paul III, the Farnese Pope, who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Supper in the Sistine Chapel. So there is artistic ability and creativity running through the family. And we can see here some early sketches. These are sort of in the early to mid 30s sketches that he painted and sketched throughout his life. And we can see that he had at least a degree of competency. So after the war, he managed to get a troopship back to England in about 1946, and he had been put through a crammer course in engineering by his regiment, the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, REME, and he saw his life mapped out as using that skill. But what happened, he met and married the daughter of a jeweler, and she wasn't very keen on him getting a job in engineering, which probably entailed him moving out of London. So she suggested that he join the family firm, HJ Company. And if you look at any early pieces of Grima, it's always stamped HJCO, which stands for Halle Jewellery. So these are some images of his early work. On the left, I think this was 1947, this sort of typical Art Deco designs which he started off designing polished platinum and diamond set. But pretty soon he evolved his style into a more abstract, organic form, and actually some of it became rather sort of sculptural. And this was not very well received in the home market, and led to him becoming effectively a traveling salesman in Europe, where his more modern work was much more readily received.
He was a very good salesman, wasn't he, William?
Sorry?
He was a very charismatic and effective salesman.
Yes, he never lacked for confidence, and he had huge belief in his own abilities, and he was charming and good looking and self-confident, and they made very good jewelry, and so he traveled around, starting off in probably in Amsterdam, moving through Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, mainly in Northern Europe. I think France and Southern Europe was more sort of conservative in their tastes.
Mm-hmm.
But he by the late 50s, he'd established a very successful business, mainly based around London and on the continent. But he hadn't really, it was really the 60s, which was the sort of epiphany for Andrew in terms of dedicating himself to a modernist style. But there were symptoms of his tendency towards abstract, organic designs, starting pretty quickly.
Thank you, William. Gina, I wanted to ask you about that, because 1961 was that Goldsmiths exhibition, and that was a real landmark show in the end, wasn't it?
Completely. And I think it was not only a breeding ground for Andrew to gain artistic direction and was influenced by other people, but it was a opportunity for him to get to know other jewelers, other artists. The exhibition itself was originally conceived to be at the Victoria and Albert Museum, with the then assistant keeper of the circulation department, which is a wonderful name in itself, called Carol Hogburn, conceiving the idea of creating a modern exhibition for the museum going public. And it was originally intended to be 300 to 400 pieces. Subsequently, the exhibition wasn't held at the V&A, but for what reasons, I think it's slightly unclear. It could be funding, it could be a number of reasons. But Hogburn and his assistant Shirley Berry approached Graham Hughes, who is the art director at the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, and he agreed to host it and hold it at Goldsmiths Hall. And I think it was so successful, and they managed to get so many people involved in lending exhibits that it actually, in the end, housed almost 1,000 pieces. And if we just go back one slide, we can see those slightly futuristic pyramidal showcases, which must have looked so, almost Star Wars in their concept in 1961, which was, the backdrop of this was a very conservative jewellery industry. William's just shown those images of this typical 1950s jewellery, and suddenly to have these slightly futuristic showcases in a very traditional setting in Goldsmiths Hall, where you can see the crystal chandeliers above. It must have been an incredibly impressive sight. And I think the particularly interesting part in the context of Andrew Grima were the two categories for British jewellery. Now, there was one category for British artists, primarily sculptors, who were asked to create models of pieces of jewellery, which were then made up by jewellers. So there were, if you like, British modern, the category was British modern work, which were the artists, and then British professionals, who were the jewellers. And H.J. Company and Andrew were in the latter category, and not only submitted designs for themselves under the auspices of H.J. Company, but also made up work by some of those British sculptors who'd submitted designs to show. And in the end, it was a hugely successful exhibition, which ran for a period of a couple of months. I think there were nearly 30,000 visitors. And it's seen, really, looking back on it, as a seminal moment for the sort of British modern jewellery movement. And I think it was also very influential for Andrew, who, if we go on to the next couple of slides, we can see, yes, this one here, where you can see at the top, there's that wonderful textured citrine ring, which was a Grima, an H.J. Company design, and made by H.J. Company. And then the bracelet on the bottom, those wonderful slabs of metal, I think this is actually made out of silver gilt, was made by H.J. Company, but the design was by the Irish sculptor Frederick McWilliam. So that was an example of how he was also interpreting sculptors' work and making it. He was having that transition, which I think was really interesting for him, and he gained a lot from that. And then we can see these are also very early 60s pieces with the turquoise matrix ring, that wave brooch, which I think I'm right, Francesca, in saying that wave brooch is currently in the Goldsmiths collection.
Yes, these three pieces
they're all
all in the Goldsmiths collection.
The Goldsmiths Hall didn't actually collect jewellery until after.
Yes, exactly.
51.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
were any of them part of that exhibition?
The one on the slide before, I think I'm right in saying that the citrine ring was.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But the first piece of Grima jewellery in the permanent collection was a year later in 1962. Even though that ring is also in the permanent collection, it's there because it was exhibited in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Well, the exhibition helped bring him to a sort of wider audience, didn't it? And it wasn't long before he had royal support. Could you tell us a bit about that, Nick and William?
Well, what's interesting was that the royal support that you talk about came first in the form of a ticking off from Lord Snowdon, who was invited by the Jewellers Association or whatever it was to have a lunch, at which he sort of got up and gave a speech, not saying thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, but he sort of slagged them off for basically being too timid in their designs. Now, Andrew Grima took exception to this and wrote persistently to Lord Snowdon's office. And eventually, a year later, Snowdon came to visit the ateliers and was absolutely, totally convinced. I mean, Snowdon was, we've all, those of you who haven't seen The Crown, I'm welcoming you back from your long coma. And the people who have seen The Crown will know exactly what a sort of, what a kind of icon of swinging London this man was. But also he was a very, very sophisticated, talk about artistic genes. I mean, Linley Sambourne, the great illustrator, was one of his antecedents. So he understood aesthetics, and also the Queen loved him and Prince Philip loved him. He was a very, I think the only member of the family who didn't really like him was his wife in the end. But they loved him, and I don't think it is unconnected that by 1966 he had got the Duke of Edinburgh, again who we've just been reminded of with his death, what an innovator he was. His award for elegant design, a Queen's Award for exports, very important, especially now we have Brexit. And also Philip had bought the Queen the Ruby Venus or Scarab brooch. Now, in William's wonderful book, we hear how she wore that for her 70th wedding anniversary. It's the one with the red things. And she wore it in 2018 for Christmas. She wore it on board the aircraft carrier. But most importantly of all, in 1966, she wore it to Bournemouth Town Hall. And there's a wonderful picture of her wearing it to Bournemouth Town Hall in William's marvelous book. Anyway, Princess Margaret by this time wanted Grima jewellery, and she sent a piece of lichen from the Balmoral estate to Andrew. And instead of, I mean, God knows, first of all, God knows how it arrived intact in the post in those days, but let's say that it did, and let's say that Andrew Grima didn't say, what the fuck is this? But actually said, he actually said, you have a flair for design, Your Royal Highness. I mean, you know, he knew how to suck up to important people when the time was required. And I mean, he was off to the races. He went to lunch at night at the palace in '68. And even though he's managed to get I think it was a potato croquette, flew across the table and landed on the Queen's foot and had to be scooped up by a footman. He was chosen by the Queen to prepare the gifts to visiting heads of state, their wives. And Madame Pompidou, for example, was very, very fortunate to receive that exquisite brooch with the royal cipher in the middle of it. Margaret Trudeau got a great piece, and the brooch given to Betty Ford is in the President Ford Library. But I mean, Princess Anne was a big Grima wearer, and even the Princess of our hearts, Lady Diana Spencer, she once was, again a very topical person today. She was given a brooch again by one of these spectacular engagements that the royal family attend that we very, very seldom hear of, that the National Eisteddfod of Wales in 1985 presented her with this exquisite jewel. Anyway, apart from that, there's royalty galore around the world. My favorites being Princess Elizabeth of Toro in Uganda and Princess Chichibu, fabulous name, of Japan. But there we are. I think that's your kind of 5 minutes sort of
that's a lovely
guide to the royals.
How about all this?
Oh, my favorite. Here, Advertising Canada Dry. The other person to appear in that series of advertisements was Sir Terence Conran. So it gives you an idea of the importance attached to Andrew Grima at that time. He was regarded as one of the leading British exports. I mean, in terms of what he did. I mean, he was a sort of great ambassador for Britain on the world stage. I mean, you can see there he's living the jet set lifestyle and smoking a pipe.
So what about his celebrity following? Because he had quite a number of famous people that weren't royal. Correct, William?
I think the interesting thing about Andrew is that his work appealed to establishment figures and the artistic community at the same time. I think it was perhaps a function of the fact that his shop, which looked completely out of this world, was in that buttoned up location in Jermyn Street, and the visitors book in the shop gives a very interesting insight as to the sort of people who moved in his circles. If I can just look at my notes. I mean, the first name in the book is Margaret, and followed by Elizabeth, Rex, or Regina, I think it would be, and Anne. So they all had a page to themselves. And then in the next sort of levels in the order of English noble titles were the Duke of Westminster, the Marquis of Bute, and the Earl of Lonsdale. And then there followed the political and diplomatic establishment, Viscount Eccles, who organised the Queen's wedding to Prince Philip, There was Lord Annan in military intelligence, Odette Churchill. The newspapers were represented by Hugh Weldon, Peter York, Shirley Conran, and business by people like the Seifs, the Sainsburys, Simon Hornby, Alistair McAlpine, and quite a few American oligarchs. And then if you turn to sort of the artistic community, there was Lulu in the book, John Osborne, against whose name Andrew wrote Angry Young Man, Carl Foreman, who directed the bridge over the River Kwai, Alec Guinness, John Gielgud, Richard Attenborough, Peter Sellers, who you can see here, Joan Collins, Susan George, Fenella Fielding, I think it was in all those Carry On films, Ronnie Corbett, and then the artists Barbara Hepworth and Elizabeth Frink, who are both personal friends of Andrew, jewelers Paolo Bulgari and Gerda Flockinger. And so that gives you a flavor of the sort of people who visited the shop. And it is a very eclectic mix of the rule makers and also the taste makers. Ursula Andress, of course, famously modeled. I think she came down from filming Casino Royale and modeled Grima in the Goldsmiths Hall.
Very fancy.
There's Peter Sellers outside the shop. So he was very groovy, as Nick liked to say.
That's a good word for it. Francesca, can you tell us a bit about the shop? Because it was really a sight to behold, wasn't it? I wish that I had seen it in the flesh.
Yes, I wish I'd seen it as an adult as well. It was incredible. So by the mid-1960s, my father had sort of grown tired of seeing his jewelry badly displayed in other people's shops and people selling it who were either not interested or unappreciative of his designs. So he, as with everything in his life, he took a big, big risk, mortgaged himself up to the hilt, and decided to open his own shop. So both his brothers were architects, Godfrey and George, and so he enlisted them to design the shop, and they in turn collaborated with Brian Neal and Geoffrey Clark, who were two modern British sculptors of the time. And Brian Neal designed this fantastic steel and Welsh slate facade, which is very brutalist. And Geoffrey Clark designed the 10-foot-high aluminium door, which was a novelty at the time because you stood on the doormat and it would open electronically. Well, as a 4-year-old, as you can see in the center picture, I used to love jumping up and down on the doormat and watch it swivel backwards and forwards, which led to the mechanism breaking and infuriated my father.
I think every child who visited the shop did the same thing. So it was, it was infuriating. So the facade, which was designed by Geoffrey Clark, by Brian Neal, was wonderful. It had these varying, these showcases on various heights. So you either had to tiptoe or duck to see into them, which sort of added to the preciousness of the jewels within. And it really did look like some sort of extraterrestrial landing on the corner of Jermyn Street and Duke Street, St. James's.
Amazing. It had a fantastic staircase too, didn't it?
Yes, so the spiral staircase, which went from the ground floor into the basement round room, was made of acrylic, which was a new material at the time and had never been used in architecture before. So Godfrey and George designed it, but really didn't know how to make it work. And so they enlisted the help of Peter Rice from Ove Arup Engineers to come and make it work. And he did, although there was this huge concern that the steel cable that ran through the center of it was under such tension that should it break, it would have shot through 2 floors of the Cavendish Hotel above. So, so that was quite a nerve-wracking experience, I think. Yeah. And so the white rotunda on top there was my father's office. which was fantastic. It had this sort of vertical slit window, so he could see who was coming in and out of the shop, which was practical. And on the bottom, you'll see these wonderful coffee table height showcases with a sort of a leather frame, which you could sit around and sort of look into the showcases if it were a pond full of glittering jewels, which I used to love as a child, sort of just sitting there and looking at the sparkling jewels.
And the downstairs at that shop provided a great place for him to exhibit his collections. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. It was I think a later addition to the shop, and then they realized that it was a fantastic space to have parties and exhibit all the collections that he later did. Yeah.
Nick, I think one of his most famous collections is his watch collection about time for Omega. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
I mean, what's interesting for me about these the watch collection that he did is that it sort of, in a way, was the beginning of the second half of his career, in my opinion, because he started doing these themed collections, some of which we'll see later, which were brilliant. I mean, real, like a sort of great couturier's collection. And he was given the idea to do this by a man called Robert Foster, who was working for Omega at the time. Omega was, I mean, still is a big watch brand, but at the time it was super famous. This was 1969 because men had gone to the moon wearing Omega. So this man wanted to show that they could also design watches for women, because it was for divers, for aviators, for motor racers, but they were behind a bit on the women thing. So this chap tried to reach Grima in London. Then he went to America to catch up with him, and persuaded him, or rather Andrew. I mean, William said it was £1 million deal, but it was around about 80 pieces. I think 54 pieces of timekeepers, and the remainder in other pieces of jewelry. But as you can see, how many?
52 watches.
52 watches, 52 timekeepers. I mean, because they are so exciting to look at. I mean, here's one. Here's the sort of, this is probably the one that is the most common. This isn't part of the on time, but it I don't know if you can see this, because I can't see anything in the screen. But anyway, this is the teak watch, and it's a very wearable version of what he got up to for Omega. I mean, what was quite funny was that when he went over with the wooden maquettes, these Swiss people were slightly taken aback, and then the managing director's wife saw the designs and bought one of the pieces, and they knew they were off to the races. At the launch exhibition, even though the most expensive piece was £7,500, which would have bought you a small Ferrari. I have the model Ferrari here, but it'll take me too much time to find it in my notes. Maybe it was a 365. But anyway, you still would have had £500 change. But that, I mean, they sold so well. And the thing then went on tour to Japan, to Switzerland, and around the world. And it really became this great sensation. I mean, certainly watchmaking had never seen anything like this before. They had worked with a Swiss jeweler, Gilbert Albert, as had Patek Philippe. But this was, I mean, given the worldwide celebrity of Andrew Grima at this time, and also the fact that Omega was at that point at the height of its fame, having done the watch that went to the moon, which was the defining event, I think, of the 1960s in many ways. You had this conjunction of two great brands. Now everybody said, I mean, I speak to a lot of marketing people, and they always tell me, we're doing a collaboration with Supreme. And I mean, everybody thinks they've just dreamed up this idea of collaborating. If you look at this was, 50 years ahead of its time in terms of the audacity of the designs, but also the daring of this very traditional Swiss watch company prepared to take a gamble on this eccentric British jeweler.
They gave him a great deal of control, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think he had entire control of the whole project. I mean, he was just let do what he wanted, and then the same executive, Robert Foster, moved over to work for Hamilton, which produced this watch called the Pulsar Time Computer. If you watch the beginning of Live and Let Die, you will see a prototype of this on James Bond's wrist. In the early 70s, this was the watch to have. The Shah, who was a great watch collector, ordered it. Sammy Davis Jr. ordered it. President Ford ordered it. Everybody wanted one of these things. But by the latter half of the 1970s, it was a race to the bottom in terms of price, because the electronic components could be replicated at such low price that Texas Instruments and various Japanese manufacturers were getting in on the act. And these light emitting diode watches were becoming very commonplace. So they thought that they would get Andrew to, I suppose in the professional term would be to pimp up some of these LED watches. And I mean, I think in a way they're even more satisfying as examples. I mean, I've got one, I'm wearing one that's a bit like the one on the far right of the screen, except it's an analog. Can you see it?
No, move your arm to the left.
Yeah, got it.
You can see it slightly. Yeah.
I mean, I think that this, I mean, it's less well known than Omega because it was less successful. It was a less extensive execution. But I think that the pieces themselves are, in a way, I mean, a great artist, I find, you can sort of look through their lives and they're defined by what they leave out. And the more they leave out, the kind of more serene the work. And I think if you compare these pieces with the Omegas, you're getting to a much less cluttered, I mean, you're seeing a great artist entering a new phase of his canon. And I mean, I missed the chance to buy something like the second one in from the left because I'm a terrible snob about electronic versus mechanical watches, and I really regret that now.
You do.
Yeah, I certainly do. But I mean, if you ever find one, even if it doesn't work, just whatever it is, buy it.
Yeah,
they're very pure in design, aren't they? These Pulsar watches.
And we've only ever seen about 10 of them. So the collection must be, there might be 20 of them total in the world.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So that About Time collection in '69 then sort of prompted him to do the same in jewellery. Am I right, Jean?
That's right, yes. And following on from what Francesca said about in terms of the shop, in terms of presenting things in a way that he thought was appropriate, the lower the basement of the shop was given over to the collection. So he'd moved away from allowing other people to show his items with the shop in '66, and that extra space in the basement of the shop allowed him to formulate collections, and he did them for the first 4 or 5 years of the '70s, the first one being Opals and Pearls, which dates from 1970. And the thing that really strikes me about this first collection is that, if you look historically at both those, both opals and pearls, opals are used liberally in Victorian jewellery and in Art Nouveau jewellery, but less so in jewellery from the sort of 20s and 30s onwards. So, it was sort of a material that was perhaps conceived as slightly old-fashioned. But it was, Andrew was interested in it because of the play of colour and because it was something different. And he presented it in a startlingly modern way. If we look at this Boulder opal pendant here on the left and the drawing of it on the right, you can see the gold sort of emerging from the opal itself. It's that wonderful union of metal and stone, which he is so successful in doing. And he used a lot of Australian opals from Lightning Ridge. It was a stone that had previously been slightly forgotten. And the same, actually, if you go on to the next slide and we see pearls, pearls in the 1950s are associated with a very kind of traditional type of jewelry. If you think of the Queen with her double strand pearl necklace, and that was very much a sort of formula at that era, and it was all about uniformity in shape and uniformity in color. But Andrew went, rode a coach and horses through that idea completely, and you can see that wonderful necklace on the right hand side where there's nothing that is, you know, in terms of the uniformity. He's celebrated the idea of difference and the idea of slightly different colors, and he's made it very modern, and I think people appreciated that. And you know, Nick used the word audacious, and I think that's a very appropriate word to use when you look at his collections, because if you go back into the next collection, which is Rock Revival, it's all about, you can see the amethyst crystals, and you can see the citrine crystal pendant, which is just 4 oval slabs of citrine crystal. You know, these were materials that were in essence not terribly valuable, but Andrew was presenting them in a way and asking a price tag for them that was for real jewelry. And the same could also be said of the Super Shell collection. He was clever in that he made some of the price points entry level. You know, there were things that were you know, a few hundred or maybe £1,000, which was still a lot of money then, right up to the much more expensive items. But you know, he was presenting things in an incredibly different way, and it just served to demonstrate that it was about the concept and the design, and his use of materials were really a vehicle in order to demonstrate that. And that's what I think is so clever about all these collections. And so in terms of the collections, there is Opals and Pearls in 1970, Rock Revival in 71, where he used, we just seen that, with those amethyst crystals, very Barbarella, I always think. And then the Super Shells in 72. And then 73, we've got Sticks and Stones, which is those wonderful long, very long tourmaline crystals, sometimes watermelon tourmaline, where you can see the 2 colors of tourmaline. And then the bracelet on the left, which is the emerald crystals. And this is also where he does slices. So it's not just the long tubes, it's slices of crystal as well. And there's that wonderful photo in William's book of, I think it's Jojo wearing a ruby and zoisite large slice pendant, which is just, and it's a big slice, and it's really fantastic. And then the final collection, I think, is 1974, which is again to do with pearls. This is Tale of Tahiti. And again, this is mainly colored pearls, so more towards the grays rather than the goldens, which he had used in his 1970 collection. But the other thing that strikes me about this is, you know, these large cultured pearls. This is a good 20 years before the Tahitian and South Sea cultured pearls that we know in the 90s became super fashionable and super valuable. So, you know, in every way, his use of material and the concept to deliver that material in the finished product is really revolutionary.
Incredible, aren't they? Francesca, I mean, your father, that was the last of the big collections, I understand, but he carried on making jewelry till he died.
Yes.
I understand. And you continue that legacy today with your mum. Can you tell us how that has lived on?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so my father's designs were very, I would say they were bold, sculptural, abstract. And I think abstraction is the most difficult school of art to get right, because it all comes from intuition. And I feel that my father just somehow, everything he designed flowed so elegantly. And it was really, I mean, he wanted the gold to look as though it had just come out of nature and the stone had sort of just appeared through the gold. And that's also how he set the pieces. He never liked claws. He never liked using claws. He wanted it to look as though it was some sort of natural, it had some sort of natural existence. And diamonds were never a protagonist, or most of the time they weren't, only in special commissions. So he used diamonds as highlights to highlight the semi-precious stones. So that was really the main part of his philosophy, I think.
And how do you continue that today in your work? I mean, is he still a constant influence?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we still have very much the same design philosophy as my father did. We still work in yellow gold, mostly textured, although I tend to prefer brushed gold. We use semi-precious stones. We love finding sort of interesting and new, I mean, not new, but interesting stones to work with, and crystals. And there's always that ethos at the back of our heads. You know, my father, you know, the craftsmanship, we still work with the same goldsmiths that my father worked with in the 60s and 70s. And we only make 30 to 40 pieces a year. So they're all unique, all handmade in England. And we love, my mother and I love to oversee every step of the creation of the piece, because we also like to change a design while it's being made if we think that it would, you know, if it would be beneficial to it.
Yeah. And Jean, you've seen a sort of growing interest in Grima in recent decade or so.
That's right. At Bonhams, we had our first standalone sale of Andrew Grima's work in 2006 when Andrew was still alive. And that came about because we'd noticed a real increase in not only in interest, but in perhaps items coming onto the market. And we've been at the forefront, and we've been lucky enough also to offer some wonderful collections of Grima jewellery. And the collecting base is incredibly diverse, and it's spread globally. And I think that speaks to the fact that, you know, there were Grima shops in the US and in Australia and throughout Europe. But it's interesting. I think there are now the people who have always loved Grima, but there are a new band of collectors who are appreciative and understanding of his work as now, who haven't previously known him, which I think is interesting.
Why do you think that is? Is that just part of the sort of returning fashion of the 70s? You know,
I think there's also an understanding and an appreciation of the concept of these pieces are individual pieces and creating small wearable art objects. That whole philosophy, which was pioneered by Grima in, you know, from 1961 onwards, with, you know, it was born out of the international exhibition. I think people understand that, and I think it, you know, if we look at a millennial, those are traits that are appreciated and understood in a newer generation as well.
Yeah, Nick, I know you're rather partial to some of the humour in his work.
Well, there's plenty that I mean, I just love these objects. There's an ashtray which actually has, I smoke cigars, and unfortunately there's not one with a cigar in it, but there is a sort of trompe-l'oeil, if that's a correct term for these things, cigarette. And even with the glowing end, it's, I mean, there is a wit about these things that one just doesn't see so much these days. Because I mean the pencil shaving, but it's not just a pencil shaving. It's not just like a pop art representation. He's taken the form of a pencil shaving and made it into something beautiful. Do you know what I mean? And you can see the influence here on other jewelers. For example, you know, for example, the gin and tonic or whatever it is, you know, one sees that in other jewelers now. And I mean, I think that without Andrew Grima, you wouldn't get that kind of work today. I mean, some of the stuff is downright weird, like the birds made of shells. I mean, I would quite like one of those, but the thing I would like most is the model of Snowdon's aviary that he did. Although I understand there are two important struts missing from it, and that Snowdon, in his inimitable way, took Andrew to task on this very matter. But they became great friends. I mean, there's just so much to love about this man's work that, I mean, you know, and I'm very mean and very selfish. And it, you know, such is the quality and the ingenuity and the audacity of the stuff that it gives me great pleasure to buy it for my wife, even though I won't be able to wear it. So he must have been good.
Yes.
Sorry, Rachel, I just wanted to go back a slide, and because there was something I wanted to talk about my father's inspiration, which was so wonderful. Yes, this one. So when I was a teenager, I used to drink iced tea out of a carton with a plastic straw. And I remember walking into my father's office and sort of sitting there and nervously knotting the plastic straw while I was probably being told off for smoking weed at school or something. And I just left it on his desk. And the next thing I knew was he designed this gold straw brooch, which I thought was fantastic. And then the tubes at the bottom there, the workshop had ordered gold wire from the bullion dealer in the 70s. And the bullion dealer had sent gold tube by mistake. And rather than sending it back, my father said, oh, I think I can do a design with this anyway. So that's how the gold tube collection came about, which I think it's fantastic that his inspiration was so accidental at times.
Yeah, and I love the Niemeyer pieces that are on the next slide.
Yes, they're wonderful. So that was from a visit to, next slide, yeah, thank you. From a visit to Brasilia, my father saw Oscar Niemeyer's cathedral and was very much inspired by it to design the green tourmaline ring on the left and the pearl ring that looks very much like the bell tower next to the cathedral.
Amazing.
I think one of the important things about Andrew's work is that, unlike a lot of the artist jewelers who learnt, goldsmithing at St. Martin's or the Royal College, and then set up their own workshops and made their own pieces, Andrew never. He was a designer basically. He was more like Fabergé or Bridget Riley. He insisted, he had to, because he couldn't make jewelry himself. So there was a demarcation between design and manufacture. And so he set up these enormous workshops with really the best goldsmiths from all over Europe. Any goldsmith worth his salt or her salt wanted to work in the Grima workshop because the work they did was so exciting. And I think that really unleashed his designs and creativity, because he was never constrained by having to make the damn things himself. And so he could make better and he could make more, which again is one of the reasons why there is a bit of a market for Grima. He made unique pieces, but he managed to make a lot of unique pieces, because he had to feed this empire of shops. I mean, he didn't have it empty. He wasn't like Ernest Jones or a multiple retailer, but he had a shop in Sydney. He had three galleries in Tokyo. He had a shop in Zurich, and he had the London shop as well, and another one for the Madmen on Madison Avenue. So he had to design, at the peak of his international fame, he had to design maybe 2,000 unique pieces a year, which is an incredible feat of ingenuity. And if you look through the archives, they're all astounding. His quality never dropped. And even after the 70s, when he resettled in Switzerland, his productivity went down because he didn't have to make so many pieces, but the quality was maintained throughout his life. And so I think that's an incredible legacy, to be able to maintain that level of quality and creativity, in a 50-year career.
Yes, right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm getting a bit confused with my questions now. Well, I guess is to ask briefly, if we have time, what his legacy is today to the jewelry world. Francesca, I don't know if you'd like to start with that question.
I think that was William's.
Well, I mean, for me, his career started in 1946, but he's really famous for the work he did from say 61 until about 75. So he operated over 2 decades, As Nick has alluded to, he was revolutionary in the 60s, and he changed gear again in the 70s. I think it's incredible to think that he was that relevant over those 2 decades. Of course, in the 60s, there was an enormous amount of creativity that was London-based. There was a cultural revolution coming out of London, and the Beatles had moved down to London. There was Quentin Bieber, there was Blake and Hamilton inventing pop art. There was, there were Pinter and and Osborne revolutionizing the theatre. And I think you could, in the world of jewelry, you can mention Grima in that group. He was part of that game-changing outburst of creativity that started in the 60s. There were others, obviously. There was John Donald, Gerda Flockinger, David Thomas, Charles de Temple. But Andrew Grima was easily the most successful and most celebrated jeweler of that period. And he had
William, I think he was almost more than just that. I mean, I think his great sort of victory was to cut across these things. I mean, he was one of the, I suppose, Cartier in Paris at the turn of the century. But I mean, he was a celebrity. I mean, he wasn't just he wasn't a manual worker at all. I mean, he was a visionary. He was an artist, and his work cut across it sort of went far beyond the jewelry ghetto. I mean, I love the Canada Dry advertisement, but that a large internationally known soft drinks company would select him to be the face of their brand says something about the appeal way beyond those who could afford his pieces to a wider audience and I think a wider impact. Would you agree?
Yes, I think, especially because things got very exciting in the 60s, and it's certainly in jewelry. Post-war, as you say, Paris was the epicenter for creativity, the Art Deco look, and so the world pivoted from Paris to London post-war. And Andrew Grima was really at the epicenter of that movement. Before he came along, working with minerals and shells and semi-precious stones, I think jewelry was it was something that you inherited and then put in a safe, or else it was very trite and boring and derivative. It was crescents and horseshoes, and it was very polite and very boring. And he completely, he was a complete game changer and made it incredibly exciting and fashionable and groovy. And that's, I think, it was the contrast between what he was doing and what went before that was so dramatic. And that's why he changed the conversation for people interested in jewelry, not just in this country, but around the world.
Yeah, thank you, William. I think you're absolutely right. And thank you, everyone. We have to wrap it up, unfortunately, but before we take questions, we have a video showing you what a celebrity Andrew Grima was at the time. Here he is in 1966 talking to London Live about his design process.
When one thinks of baubles such as these, one usually thinks of glamorous, glittery quarters of London, such as Regent Street or Burlington Arcade or Bond Street, the centre for elegant shops and famous jewellers. Well, on the fringes of all this, there's a small company in Shaftesbury Avenue who've recently walked off with all the honours for their beautiful jewellery, in the face of their famous rivals. The exterior's unprepossessing. They may not have ruffled the pages of Debrett as yet. But Andrew Grima of H.J. Company has just won the Duke of Edinburgh's prize for elegant design. And it's for this jewellery And HJ is also in favour for having won, along with firms like Rolls-Royce and Wedgwood, the Queen's Award for Industry for their exports. The man behind HJ is Andrew Grima, a mechanical engineer who turned jeweller to work in his father-in-law's company. And now 20 years later, he's in sole charge of a firm that's not only 30 strong, but one that makes 1,500 new pieces a year and exports to the tune of £100,000. The emphasis is one of fine workmanship, but in the modern idiom. They don't go in for diamond bumblebees or poodles with ruby eyes. And Mr. Grima, you as a mechanical engineer, this sounds an odd sort of a background really for a man who makes jewellery, but perhaps it's been an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Yes, I think the fact that I had no training in the design and making of jewellery from a tender age has allowed me to have an uninhibited approach to design in jewellery, and as a result of this, of course, my pieces are far more daring than the type that one sees nowadays, not only in England but any other part of the world.
They certainly feel marvellous. These are the pieces that won the Duke of Edinburgh's award, aren't they?
That's correct.
Do you have any particular favourite pieces yourself?
I particularly like this gold and diamond brooch, which is one of my latest pieces.
Gorgeous.
It gives the impression of a cloud formation.
Is that where you got the idea, in fact?
It is, yes.
These designs are so unconventional and so modern, and I'm wondering if perhaps this is all part of the trend of dressing now, so that it fits more in with our way of living than us being in a dress where we're all part and parcel of something.
Yes, I think that's true. One doesn't consciously design to make one's jewellery to fit in with modern dress, so one follows the line that one has at the back of one's mind, and I think that the environment that we have in London in particular today provides an inspiration for the type of design that you see here.
And so we're all really rather getting more with it in jewellery, not
Yes,
just
there's no
one
doubt
particular
about
type
it.
of person. Mr. Grima, thank you very much.
Really wonderful clip. I'll move on to the questions. The first one is, what do you think Grima would make of NFTs? That's non-fungible tokens, the big craze in the art world at the moment. If he was alive today, would he be selling NFTs of his jewellery?
I think he had a hard time with the fax machine. So trying to, sitting there, I can just imagine myself sitting there in his office trying to explain NFTs to my father and him sort of dozing off. I don't think he would have, I don't think that would have been something that interested him. I mean, all our pieces are non-fungible anyway, but I don't think he would have particularly been interested in getting into sort of anything sort of digital tokens would not have been his thing, no.
Unless someone persuaded him that there was money in it, and then I think he think that might have been interesting. I
don't know, because he was obviously a businessman, but money didn't come before everything, and I think he was very true to, you know, I don't think so.
Someone else asked what happened to the facade of the wonderful shop on Jermyn Street. Is it in storage somewhere, or was it destroyed?
We heard it was in storage somewhere, but we don't know, because Francis, the tapestry shop, took over the shop, and the facade ended up in storage, but we don't know exactly what happened, because then we moved to Switzerland, so we sort of lost track. They tried to get it listed, but I think it would have been very hard for, it should have been listed really, but
I think it
would have been very hard for the next retailer to have done any business unless they'd been a jeweler. I think it'd be hard to sell carpets from that shop.
Yeah.
Unless you had a photograph of a carpet in the window, but I think,
a tiny window. How many goldsmiths did Andrew have at his height? Do you
65.
know? 65.
Yeah.
So it's quite a significant amount of people, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And he had people working for him that went on to become jewelers, you know, with their own name and their own right.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Alan Gard, Becca.
Yeah.
Yeah, and someone else asked a very interesting question. Laura Schmitz, she says, how difficult, Francesca, is it to be true to your father's identity and forge your own identity within the Grima company?
It's very difficult, but I mean, I tend to sort of have imposter syndrome a lot of the time, but it is difficult because you sort of set about not trying not to be too inspired by his work, but it is innate. And, you know, I'll always have my father, you know, behind me thinking, you know, when I'm thinking of a design. I'm also inspired by contemporary architecture, artists of our day. So it's difficult. Yeah.
Did you and your mother design jewellery when he was alive? Were you both involved?
Yes, we both did. Yeah. And in fact, when I quit school when I was 18, we used to design together, and he would teach me, you know, the process, which was lovely.
Yeah, what a great teacher.
Yeah.
Jean, where do you think his collector base is biggest? Is it in the UK, or is it in America, or where?
I think there's a very big client base in the UK, but as I said before, I think it has international appeal. There's certainly a big and growing appreciation of Grima's work in the US, for sure. And these are people who hadn't necessarily known the shop. These are clients new to Grima. And equally in Asia as well. So I think it has a broad appeal, but just because of the history here in the UK, I think perhaps the largest portion of Grima clients are UK based.
Yeah.
Are you noticing some custom business out of China? Because I know he obviously had some legacy business in Tokyo, but is he reaching other parts of Asia?
I would say Hong Kong rather than China, and I think there's also interest in Taiwan, funnily enough.
Someone else says, do you have any tips, Jean and Nicholas, for a budding collector of Grima?
Well, I think both Nicholas and I are kicking ourselves that we didn't buy more Grima 10 years ago. So if you see it, buy it, would be my tip.
Yeah, because it'll be more expensive.
Exactly. And also talk to the Grimas about the authenticity of these things, because their archive is quite spectacular. So they really, they got there, and they make beautiful stuff today. So you still can collect a primary market as well as secondary market.
Yes.
I mean, I'm wearing a modern Grima ring, a contemporary Grima ring. I think your mother made this for me, Francesca, about 8 years ago, something like that.
Yes, beautiful.
It's fantastic. It's a daily companion. So yeah, I mean, buy expensively and often, I would say, is the rule to follow. You can't buy cheaply, I'm afraid.
We have a section on the website that's called Authenticate, and you can just click on it and send us images of the piece if you want to have it authenticated before you purchase it, or if you've purchased it and want to make sure. So that's also
fantastic. So there's
buy at Bonhams, I suppose, would be the word from our sponsor, wouldn't it? Always buy if you can.
There's a question about Bonhams. I don't know if it's from a Bonhams employee, but it says, is Bonhams now specially regarded as the place to buy Grima? And is that a result of the 2006 auction, or just?
I think it's something that's evolved over since 2006, where when Andrew was still alive, Andrew and Jojo were very generous in helping at that time when we staged that first standalone sale, and as a result of that, we've had a lot of Grima pieces, and then we've had other standalone sales. We had a big collection in only a couple of years ago, 55 pieces, which was the largest collection of Grima.
That was a fantastic collection.
It was an absolutely wonderful collection. And Francesca and Jojo have always been incredibly generous in helping us and providing details from the archive. So there's been a long-standing collaboration between Bonhams and Grima. So we're very happy to have sold so much, but this is a relationship that we hope will go into the future as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that is all we have time for. Thank you everybody for being here from home and on the panel, and I hope you continue to all love Grima jewellery.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah,
thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.